When you picture ancient Egypt, what comes to mind? Probably towering pyramids, mysterious pharaohs, and lots of golden treasure, right? Well, for centuries, that's pretty much all we had. A picture built on legend, not really on fact. But over the last 200 years, a handful of incredible discoveries completely rewrote the story, turning a world of myth into one of documented history.
For the longest time, our image of ancient Egypt was pure Hollywood. It was the civilization just shrouded in mystery. We thought its writings were some kind of magical spell, and its greatest wonders, the pyramids, well, everyone just assumed they were built on the backs of countless slaves. That was the accepted story, a romantic and, honestly, a pretty grim fantasy.
So, the big question is, how did we get from all that speculation to what we know for sure today? Well, the answer lies in a few key discoveries that were absolute game changers, unlocking the secrets of a civilization that had been silent for thousands of years.
Okay, the first, and let's be real, the biggest hurdle was the language. Imagine trying to understand an entire culture when you can't read a single word they wrote. For centuries, that was the reality for anyone trying to study ancient Egypt. Their writing system, hieroglyphs, wasn't even really seen as a language. Scholars actually believed they were mystical symbols, some kind of unbreakable code used by priests. Because of this, 3,000 years of Egyptian records, their entire history, their beliefs, their daily lives, were completely sealed off. It was like a library where every single book is locked shut.
And then, in 1799, everything changed. The Rosetta Stone was found. This thing was the ultimate historical cheat sheet. Why? Because it had the same official decree written in 3 scripts, and one of them was ancient Greek, a language scholars already knew. All of a sudden, they had the key to finally unlock the puzzle.
So, using that Greek text as a guide, a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion finally cracked the code in the 1820s. And this was a massive, massive turning point. Suddenly, Egypt could speak for itself. Royal decrees, religious texts, even personal letters. An entire civilization's voice was restored.
So, with the language finally unlocked, scholars could start going back and re-examining all the old assumptions. And one of the biggest ones was about the most famous monuments of all, the pyramids. Yeah, that old myth of slave labor was about to meet some hard evidence.
The whole idea of slaves building the pyramids really comes from ancient historians like Herodotus, who wrote about it centuries after it even happened. His account of these huge crews of forced laborers just became the accepted story, and believe it or not, it stuck for over 2,000 years.
But here's where archaeology steps in and just changes everything. When excavators started uncovering the areas around the pyramids, not just the pyramids themselves, they found something that completely blew that old story out of the water.
They found the builder's village, and the evidence inside was just stunning. These were not slaves. These people lived in organized housing, they got food and wages from the state, and many of them were skilled artisans who could read and write. And get this, they even found records of labor strikes when workers felt their wages were late. The pyramids were built by respected, professional laborers, not slaves.
All right, the next huge leap in our understanding came from a single, almost unbelievable discovery. See, for centuries, tomb robbers had emptied out nearly every royal burial site, leaving us with just fragments. But in 1922, that all changed. Over 5,000 artifacts. Just think about that number. That's what Howard Carter found when he opened the nearly intact tomb of a pretty little-known pharaoh named Tutankhamun. The sheer scale was just breathtaking. This wasn't just a tomb, it was a perfectly preserved time capsule.
The discovery's impact was massive. First, it gave us this perfect snapshot of royal burial customs and their beliefs about the afterlife. Second, it sparked a global phenomenon called Egyptomania that influenced art, fashion, you name it, all through the 1920s. And third, it put King Tut back on the map. He'd literally been erased from history, but this discovery brought his entire story roaring back to life.
So, we've debunked myths about their language and their labor. But there was another major misconception floating around. This idea that Egypt was an isolated kingdom, totally cut off from the rest of the world by its vast deserts.
The old view was simple, right? Egypt was a world all on its own. But a totally different discovery revealed that the reality was way more complex. The new view shows Egypt as a major international power, one that was deeply connected to other great empires through diplomacy, trade, and even war.
The evidence for this came from a collection of clay tablets known as the Amarna Letters. And what's so incredible about these is that the letters weren't even written in Egyptian. They were in a shared international language, sent from the kings of Babylon, Assyria, and other major powers to the pharaohs. They were talking about trade deals, royal marriages, complex alliances. This proved Egypt was a central hub in a Bronze Age global network.
And we're not just learning about kings and diplomats. I mean, very recent discoveries, like the unearthing of a massive, preserved city called Aten back in 2020, are giving us this incredible window into the daily life of ordinary people in a bustling city at the absolute peak of Egypt's power.
And that brings up a really important point. This story is far from over. History isn't just something you read in a book. It's a living, breathing field of discovery that's being updated all the time.
Even today, right now, major excavations are rewriting what we know. At sites like Taposiris Magna, archaeologists are finding thousands of artifacts that are changing our entire understanding of Cleopatra's time. And you know what? Some of the biggest questions are still unanswered. The tomb of Cleopatra herself, one of the most famous women in all of history, is still out there somewhere, just waiting to be found.
So, from cracking hieroglyphs to finding lost cities, each discovery has peeled back another layer of myth, replacing it with the complex, fascinating, and really human story of a real civilization. It just makes you wonder, with so much still buried beneath the sands, what incredible discovery is coming next, and what monumental chapter of ancient Egypt's story has yet to be written?
So for centuries, the smartest historians on Earth looked at ancient Egypt and basically got it completely fundamentally wrong.
Oh, completely. Like, not even close.
Right. I mean, they looked at these massive stone pyramids rising out of the desert and immediately visualized, armies of brutalized slaves.
Yeah, that was the default assumption for a very long time.
And they looked at the intricate hieroglyphics carved into the temple walls and just saw literal magic, like mystical spells or unknowable ancient runes.
Exactly. We had this incredibly persistent, romanticized image of this static, mystical, almost alien society that was just isolated out there in the sand.
But really, it was a civilization built entirely out of our own speculation, wasn't it?
It was. Because when you're standing in front of a monumental structure like, say, the Great Sphinx, and you have absolutely no hard data about the people who built it, the human imagination just rushes in to fill that void.
Nature abhors a vacuum, right?
Exactly. And for a very long time, imagination and mythology were essentially the only tools historians actually had.
Well, today, for this deep dive, we are taking a sledgehammer to that mythology.
I love that. We really are.
We are cracking open the actual dirt under the fingernails evidence. We have this massive stack of sources today that track a timeline of archaeological turning points for you.
It's such a fascinating timeline.
It really is. We're starting with a heavily contested slab of rock pulled out of the sands in 1799, and we're going all the way to an entire perfectly preserved lost city uncovered as recently as 2020.
The overarching narrative here is really the evolution of a discipline. I mean, the story of Egyptology is essentially the story of physical evidence systematically dismantling our preconceived notions.
Piece by piece.
Yeah, piece by piece. Every single discovery we are going to explore today with you does the exact same thing. It takes a deeply ingrained cultural myth, shatters it, and replaces it with a reality that is infinitely more complex.
And highly sophisticated.
Highly sophisticated, and honestly deeply human.
The best way to visualize this deep dive, I think, is to imagine we're finally getting the ultimate director's cut of human history.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Thanks. Because for thousands of years, humanity only had the promotional poster for the movie.
Right. Just the highlights.
Yeah, we had the giant monuments and the vague, sensationalized rumors. But the discoveries we are digging into today, these gave us the actual script.
They did.
They gave us the behind-the-scenes footage of how these people lived, how they negotiated, how they worked, and honestly, how they complained.
And to read that script, to actually understand a civilization beyond just, staring at its architecture, you first have to understand what the people are saying.
You have to give them their voice back.
Precisely, which is where we have to start. Because before 1799, ancient Egypt was effectively a silent movie.
Literally silent.
Yeah. You had these sprawling temples in Luxor and Karnak, completely covered from floor to ceiling in these incredible vibrant carvings.
The birds, the snakes, the little seated figures.
Exactly. And nobody on the planet had the faintest idea what any of it meant. It was just an intellectual dead end.
But it wasn't just a dead end because the language was old, right? I mean, our sources point out there was a massive ideological block there.
Oh, a huge one. Before the big breakthrough, the entire European academic establishment operated on this entirely false assumption.
What were they getting wrong?
Well, they looked at hieroglyphics and concluded, based mostly on writings from much later Greek and Roman philosophers, that these were purely ideographic.
Meaning what, exactly?
Meaning they believed each individual picture represented a single, profound, philosophical concept.
Ah, okay. So they thought it was basically a system of ancient mystical emojis.
That is exactly how they treated it.
Like you draw a picture of a bird and it means bird, or maybe it means the concept of flight, or I don't know, the human soul.
Right. They didn't think it was a phonetic alphabet at all. They couldn't wrap their heads around the idea that a picture of a bird could just represent the literal sound of the letter A.
Which is so wild to think about now.
It is. They were looking at a highly complex grammatical system and treating it like a series of magical tarot cards.
And that assumption just completely paralyzed the translation effort for centuries.
It did. Even when the Rosetta Stone was discovered in 1799, during Napoleon's campaign in Egypt, it didn't instantly solve the problem like people think it did.
Okay, let's unpack this, because the mechanics of the Rosetta Stone are just fascinating to me.
It's an incredible artifact.
It's essentially this massive grenadier-right public bulletin board from 196 BC.
Yeah, that's a good description.
And the key to it is that it broadcasts the exact same state decree in 3 different scripts.
Right. You have ancient Greek at the bottom.
Which scholars in 1799 could read perfectly well.
Exactly. Then you have Demotic in the middle, which was the everyday administrative handwriting of the later Egyptian period.
Like they're cursive, basically.
Sort of, yeah. And then at the top, you have the formal monumental hieroglyphics.
So it was basically an ancient universal translator, a massive linguistic cipher key.
The ultimate translation matrix.
But here is where I always get tripped up, and where I think a lot of people probably get confused.
Okay, what's that?
If you have the Greek translation sitting right there at the bottom of the rock, shouldn't cracking the hieroglyphs at the top just be a simple one-to-one matching game?
You would think so, wouldn't you?
Right. So why did it take over 20 years, until the 1820s, for a French scholar named Jean-François Champollion to actually crack the code?
That is the perfect question. And the answer really lies in the sheer mechanical complexity of the Egyptian language, combined with that ideological block we just talked about.
The emoji problem.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If you try to do a simple one-to-one matching game-like, matching one Greek word to one hieroglyph, the math just doesn't work out at all.
What do you mean the math doesn't work?
Well, Champollion eventually just sat down and counted the words. He realized there were something like 486 Greek words on the stone,
Okay.
but there were over 1,400 hieroglyphic signs.
Oh, wow. So right away, the one picture equals one word theory completely falls apart.
It completely collapses. You have almost 3 times as many symbols as you do words.
So Champollion realizes it can't just be ideograms. What does he do next?
That was his first massive realization. The second step in his methodology was finding an anchor point.
Because how do you reverse engineer a dead language from scratch, right?
Right. You have to look for proper names, because names usually sound roughly the same across different languages.
That makes sense.
The Greek text at the bottom specifically mentioned the name Ptolemy, the ruler at the time. So Champollion looked at the hieroglyphs and noticed certain groups of symbols were enclosed in this distinct oval ring.
Right, which we call a cartouche today.
Yes. He hypothesized, quite brilliantly, that these cartouches were being used to highlight royal names.
So he assumes the symbols inside the oval must spell out Ptolemy phonetically.
Exactly. And then later, using another bilingual artifact, an obelisk from Philae, he found another cartouche that corresponded to the Greek name Cleopatra.
Oh, that's huge.
It was everything. Now, he had 2 names, Ptolemy and Cleopatra, and they share several letters, P, T, O, L, and E.
So he could cross-reference them?
He did. He cross-referenced the hieroglyphs in both cartouches. The symbol for P, which was a little square box representing a stool, was in the exact right spot for both names.
Wow.
The symbol for L, a resting lion, was in the right spot for both names.
That is incredible. I mean, that is literal detective work.
It's genius-level deduction.
He is proving unequivocally that these symbols are not magical concepts of the soul. They are just spelling out sounds. A lion isn't a mystical symbol for courage here. It just makes the L sound.
Yes, and this is why the language is so beautifully complex and why it took a genius to crack it. Champollion soon realized they weren't just phonetic.
Wait, really? What else were they?
Well, if we use a modern analogy to explain it,
Mhm.
imagine you want to write the English word belief.
Okay.
You could draw a picture of a bumblebee, followed by a picture of a leaf. Bee leaf.
Right, using symbols phonetically to sound out a word. I get that.
Yeah. But the Egyptians took it a step further. Because their language didn't write out vowels, a lot of their words ended up looking identical when written down.
Oh, that would be incredibly confusing.
Very. So, to ensure there was no confusion, they used something called determinatives.
Determinatives.
They would spell out a word phonetically, and then at the very end of the word, they would add a silent symbol, a pure ideogram, just to tell you what category of thing the word belonged to.
Oh, interesting. Give me an example of that.
Sure. If they spelled out the name of a town, they would add a little symbol of a crossroads at the end to say, hey, the word we just sounded out is a physical location.
Okay, that makes so much sense.
Or if they spelled out an abstract concept like anger, they might put a symbol of a baboon at the end, because baboons were closely associated with aggression.
So it is a hybrid system.
Yeah.
They are spelling it out phonetically, but then tagging it with a literal emoji at the end to give you the context.
That is exactly what they were doing.
No wonder it took 20 years to figure it out. It is an incredibly sophisticated, multi-layered grammatical architecture.
It's brilliant. And when Champollion finally published his findings in 1822, it was an absolute intellectual earthquake.
I can imagine.
The floodgates just opened. We didn't just have a list of names anymore. We had the entire operating system of an ancient civilization.
And what blows my mind about this, looking at the sources, is the sheer variety of what we suddenly had access to.
Oh, it wasn't just king lists.
Right. We always picture the grand, monumental texts, the massive royal decrees detailing how a pharaoh conquered a neighboring army, or, the famous Book of the Dead.
Which gives those incredibly intricate, step-by-step instructions for navigating the underworld.
Exactly. But once you have the key to the language, you don't just read the monuments, you start reading the scraps. You start translating the administrative papyri.
Which is arguably much more valuable to a historian trying to understand daily life.
Absolutely. Our sources highlight that once the code was cracked, historians started translating early medical practices. They found literal ancient prescriptions.
They could read the specific diagnoses doctors were making, the ingredients they were using for remedies like honey and crushed herbs.
But even more intimately, they started translating personal letters. They found documents of people complaining about their neighbors, arguing over who gets what in an inheritance.
Or just writing home to check in on their families.
Put yourself in the position of a 19th century historian. You have spent your entire career studying this society as if it were a pantheon of gods.
Just untouchable, mythical figures.
Right, and suddenly you were translating a papyrus where a farmer is intensely annoyed that someone borrowed his donkey and didn't return it.
It completely grounds the civilization in a way that architecture simply cannot do on its own.
It strips away the myth and replaces it with the mundane, relatable reality of human existence.
It makes them undeniably real.
It really does. And once we realized they were real, practical people writing down their daily transactions and their medical records, we had to start questioning the other massive assumptions we had made about them.
Because if they weren't just magical priests casting spells, who were the people actually doing the heavy lifting?
Exactly. How did this incredibly literate, organized society actually build its infrastructure?
Which logically leads us to the physical evidence of their labor force.
Here's where it gets really interesting.
It really does. Because if the Rosetta Stone gave us their voice, the excavations at sites like Deir el Medina and the Giza Plateau gave us their hands.
And in the process, they overturned what is undoubtedly the most stubborn, pervasive historical myth in human history.
The idea that the pyramids were built by slaves.
Yes. This myth is so deeply embedded in our global cultural consciousness that it almost feels sacrilegious to challenge it.
Everyone knows the image.
We have all seen the cinematic depictions. Cecil B. DeMille films, animated movies, pop culture, they all show the exact same scene.
Thousands of emaciated, enslaved people.
Chained together in the brutal desert heat, hauling these massive limestone blocks up a ramp, while cruel overseers crack whips against their backs.
It is a highly evocative, dramatic image. It makes for great cinema.
But archaeologically speaking,
It is entirely fabricated.
our sources point out that this narrative largely originates from Herodotus, the ancient Greek historian.
Yes, and we call him the father of history. So for thousands of years, people just took his word as absolute gospel.
But there's a massive problem with relying on Herodotus for this, isn't there?
A huge problem. Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 BC.
Okay.
The Great Pyramid of Giza was completed around 2560 BC.
Wow. So Herodotus was writing about the pyramids literally thousands of years after they were actually built.
He was essentially a tourist, writing down the local folklore, the rumors, and the assumptions of his own day.
He brought his own cultural biases with him too, didn't he?
Absolutely. The Greeks relied heavily on slave labor for their own monuments, so he just projected that reality onto the Egyptian past.
He was as far removed in time from the building of the pyramids as we are from the Roman Empire. So relying on him for the architectural logistics is just a terrible idea.
It really is. And this is where the dirt under the fingernails archaeology completely rewrites the script for us.
What did they actually find when they started digging?
When archaeologists actually started digging around the Giza Plateau and later at the worker village of Deir el-Medina down in the Valley of the Kings, they didn't find squalid mass graves.
No brutalized camps of an enslaved underclass.
Not at all. They found highly organized, intentionally planned urban infrastructure.
Let's really drill down into what organized housing means in this context, because we're not talking about temporary tents in the sand here.
No, we are talking about grid-planned streets. We are talking about solid stone houses with multiple rooms, dedicated cooking areas, and localized water supplies.
And the evidence excavated from these sites goes far beyond just proving they had a solid roof over their heads, right?
Way beyond. The administrative records we found, which, remember, we can only read because Champollion cracked the hieroglyphs detail, an incredible level of state bureaucracy dedicated to these workers.
They were on the payroll.
They were. These laborers received state-provided food and wages.
The government was directly managing the logistics of importing massive amounts of grain, fish, vegetables, and beer just to feed this workforce.
They were compensated professionals. And the archaeological finds in their homes proved they weren't just unskilled laborers blindly dragging rocks around.
What kind of artifacts did they find in the houses?
They found the specialized tools and the personal artifacts of highly skilled artisans. We're talking about master painters, expert draftsmen, sculptors, and engineers.
And crucially, our sources emphasize that a significant portion of this community was highly literate.
Yes, they were writing their own personal letters, keeping their own financial ledgers, and recording their own local histories.
You really have to consider the logistics and the ideological stakes of what they were building here.
That's a vital point. The pharaoh's tomb was not just some massive vanity project.
Right. In the Egyptian worldview, the successful transition of the pharaoh into the afterlife was the singular mechanism that maintained the cosmic balance of the universe.
A concept they called ma'at.
Ma'at, exactly. If the tomb was flawed, if the protective rituals were improperly carved into the walls, the universe would literally descend into chaos.
You absolutely do not entrust the most critical, spiritual, and national security project in your entire civilization to an abused, starving, unmotivated, and unskilled slave class.
It just doesn't make strategic sense. But I do want to push back on this just slightly because I want to make sure we aren't replacing one romanticized myth with another one here.
That's so far.
What's the pushback? It is easy to say, oh, they weren't slaves, they were respected, unionized contractors. But they were still subjects of a living god king, right?
They were.
They lived in an ancient feudal system. The pharaoh theoretically owned everything and everyone. So even if they were housed and fed well, did they actually have any real agency? Weren't they still entirely at the mercy of the state?
That is exactly the paradox we have to navigate when looking at this society. It is true they are subjects of an absolute monarch.
Right.
But the physical and textual evidence explicitly shows they possessed a shocking amount of social leverage and agency. They understood their value to the state.
And the ultimate proof of that agency, the mechanism that completely, utterly shatters the whips and chains myth, is the documented evidence of labor strikes.
Yes.
This is my absolute favorite detail from the source material. It is just mind-blowing.
It changes everything we thought we knew about their social hierarchy.
In the records found at Deir el-Medina, dating to the reign of Ramses III around 1150 BC, we have the first recorded labor strikes in human history.
And it wasn't just a minor complaint to a supervisor. It was a complete systemic breakdown. And the workers utilized their leverage brilliantly.
Okay, walk us through exactly how an ancient Egyptian strike works. Because I am picturing guys in little linen kilts holding up picket signs outside a half-built pyramid, which obviously isn't right. What physically happened?
What happened was a complete failure of the state's supply chain.
How so?
The Egyptian economy functioned on a barter and ration system, largely based on grain. The state was obligated by contract to deliver grain rations to the artisans at Deir el-Medina at the end of every single month. But during the reign of Ramses III, the state was financially exhausted. This was likely from continuous wars with a group known as the Sea Peoples, combined with massive systemic corruption in the bureaucracy.
So the money just ran out.
Basically, the grain shipments simply stopped arriving at the village.
So the workers are sitting in their village doing the most important religious and architectural work in the entire kingdom, and they aren't getting paid. They are actively going hungry.
Exactly. And they waited. 18 days passed without any rations showing up.
Wow.
So they didn't just riot randomly. They organized. They literally dropped their chisels and brushes, marched out of their walled village, and walked right down to the massive mortuary temples that functioned as the administrative centers of the region.
Specifically, the Temple of Thutmose III, right?
Yes. And they just sat down behind the temple. They staged a literal sit-in.
Imagine the sheer audacity required to do that.
It's staggering.
They are marching into the highly restricted, sacred administrative zones of the state, looking at the viziers, the highest officials in the land, men who speak directly for the living God, and saying, "We are starving. The Pharaoh's project stops today until you pay us."
If you are a slave, you do not do that.
You can't. You have zero leverage, and you'd be executed on the spot for rebellion.
The fact that they weren't executed but were instead actively negotiated with proves their unique social standing.
The local officials must have been terrified
They were. But not of the workers becoming violent. They were terrified of the work stopping.
because of Ma'at, the cosmic order.
Exactly. They knew that if the pharaoh's tomb wasn't finished, the universe was doomed. And the workers knew this too.
So they weaponized it.
They explicitly used the religious necessity of their labor as collective bargaining power.
That is just brilliant. How did the officials respond?
Well, initially, the officials scrounged up some pastries and beer to appease them temporarily.
Here, have a snack. Please go back to work.
Right. But the workers didn't just fold. They went on strike repeatedly over the next several months until the systemic issues with the grain deliveries were actually addressed.
It fundamentally changes the lens through which we view these monuments.
It really does.
When you look at a pyramid or a rock-cut tomb in the Valley of the Kings now, you aren't looking at a monument to cruelty.
No.
You are looking at a monument to incredibly complex national logistics. You are looking at supply chains, payroll departments, and the physical output of skilled self-advocating professionals.
That's beautifully said. The workers give us the real foundation of the society. But to understand the sheer scale of the wealth and theology that drove this massive economy, we have to look at the elite individuals these workers were building the tombs for.
The pharaohs themselves.
Right. And that brings us to the immense challenge of preservation. We can study the worker villages because nobody really bothers to loot a stonemason's modest house.
But the royal tombs, those were heavily targeted in antiquity.
Because they were packed with literal gold.
Grave robbing was essentially a massive secondary economy in ancient Egypt. As soon as a dynasty lost power or local security got lax, professional thieves would move in.
And ironically, it was often the very people who built the tombs or the guards paid to protect them who were doing the robbing.
Because they knew exactly where the traps were and where the gold was hidden.
Exactly. They would break in and strip the place bare. So for centuries, archaeologists were finding these magnificent, sprawling tombs, but they were completely empty.
The mummies were smashed to pieces, the gold was melted down, the artifacts were just gone.
Which is what makes the events of 1922 so profoundly significant, not just for archaeology, but for our complete understanding of Egyptian material culture.
1922, Howard Carter digging in the Valley of the Kings.
Yes. He breaches a sealed doorway, holds up a candle, and utters one of the most famous lines in historical discovery. "I see wonderful things."
He had found the tomb of King Tutankhamun. And unlike almost every other royal tomb ever discovered, it was essentially intact.
The sheer volume of data retrieved from that relatively small space is just staggering. Our sources note there were over 5,000 individual artifacts crammed into the tomb's chambers.
Let's talk about what that actually means, practically speaking. Because it wasn't just a golden sarcophagus sitting in an empty stone room.
Not at all. It was an ancient hoarder's paradise.
We are talking about dismantled golden chariots, elaborately carved wooden beds, thousands of weapons, walking sticks, perfectly preserved linen clothing,
Board games, jewelry, statues of deities.
and those massive gilded shrines nested inside one another like Russian dolls, and of course the iconic solid gold death mask.
The importance of finding 5,000 artifacts in their original undisturbed context just cannot be overstated.
Why is the context so important?
When artifacts are looted and sold on the black market, they lose all their context. We might have a beautiful statue, but we don't know where it was placed in the tomb or what specific ritual purpose it served.
I see.
But with Tutankhamun, we can see exactly how they provisioned a king for eternity. We saw the absolute pinnacle of their craftsmanship.
It allowed us to reverse engineer their techniques, right?
Yes, it allowed us to reconstruct the techniques of ancient carpenters, goldsmiths, and weavers. It provided a complete high-definition snapshot of royal theology and daily luxury.
But the truly fascinating part of this story isn't just the gold itself, is it?
No, it's the why.
Right. Why did this specific tomb survive? Tutankhamun wasn't a particularly powerful pharaoh. He died incredibly young, around 18 or 19 years old.
He was a blip on the radar historically.
So if the greatest conquerors, like Ramses II, got their massive tombs plundered, why did this teenager slip through the cracks and survive untouched for over 3,000 years?
The survival of his tomb is arguably the greatest historical irony in the entire archaeological record.
I love this part.
The mechanism behind his preservation was, ironically, bureaucratic erasure. To understand it, we have to look at the massive political turmoil caused by his father.
Yes, the Amarna period. His father, the pharaoh Akhenaten, was a radical disruptor. He essentially orchestrated a top-down religious revolution.
He completely upended the status quo. For centuries, the Egyptian state religion was a polytheistic system dominated by the cult of Amun, centered in the capital of Thebes.
And the priests of Amun were incredibly powerful.
They had amassed wealth and political power that frankly rivaled the pharaoh himself. Akhenaten takes the throne, looks at this, and systematically dismantles that entire power structure.
He just outlaws the old gods.
Outlaws them, closes the massive temples of Amun, and institutes the worship of a single abstract sun disk called the Etten.
And he didn't just change the religion. He moved the entire capital city out into the middle of the empty desert. He completely disrupted the economy and the political establishment.
It was a massive shock to the system.
It would be like a modern leader suddenly outlawing all major religions, seizing all their assets, and moving the capital from Washington, D.C. to a random patch of dirt in Nevada.
That is a very accurate comparison. It was massively unpopular with the traditional establishment.
So it was a deeply traumatic period for the power brokers.
Extremely. So when Akhenaten finally died, and his young son Tutankhamun eventually inherited the throne, the traditionalists immediately went to work.
They got their hands on the kid.
Exactly. They guided the boy king to restore the old gods, reopen the temples at Thebes, and move the capital back.
But returning things to normal wasn't enough for the establishment, was it?
Not even close.
Yeah.
Once Tutankhamun died unexpectedly, the people who took power after him, particularly a military general named Horemheb, decided they needed to completely excise that entire heretical family line from the timeline.
Like they never existed.
Yes. They initiated a campaign of damnatio memoria, the condemnation of memory.
They literally sent stonemasons with chisels across the entire empire to hack Akhenaten and Tutankhamun's names off every monument, every temple wall, and every official king list.
As far as the state bureaucracy was concerned, Tutankhamun never existed. The official timeline just skipped right over him.
So imagine you are an ancient tomb robber a few generations later.
Okay.
You have memorized the official king list, so you know whose tomb to look for when you sneak into the Valley of the Kings.
Right.
But Tutankhamun isn't on the list. The state literally canceled him. So the robbers didn't even know to look for his tomb.
And this political erasure was compounded by a literal physical one.
How so?
Because he was erased from official memory, later pharaohs didn't respect his burial site at all. When workers were building the massive tomb for Ramses VI decades later, they built their temporary stone huts and dumped tons of limestone debris right on top of the entrance to Tutankhamun's tomb.
They buried it completely by accident.
They did.
Bureaucratic erasure and literal construction debris are what accidentally saved the greatest treasure in history.
It really is poetic.
The very people who tried to destroy his legacy are the only reason his tomb wasn't robbed, and the only reason he is the most famous pharaoh on earth today. It is such a spectacular backfire.
It's amazing. And when Howard Carter finally dug through that debris in 1922, the impact was seismic.
It was a scientific triumph, certainly, providing us with that unprecedented data set of material culture. But culturally, it triggered a massive global phenomenon.
The 1920s Egyptomania.
Yes. Our sources detail how the discovery perfectly coincided with the rise of mass media and photojournalism.
The timing was perfect.
Photographs of the golden mask and the chariot were splashed across the front pages of newspapers from London to New York to Tokyo. Suddenly, the entire globe was obsessed.
It thoroughly saturated the zeitgeist of the era. If you look at the Art Deco movement of the 1920s and 30s, the visual language is heavily indebted to the geometry and motifs found in Tutankhamun's tomb.
Oh, absolutely. Architects started integrating lotus flowers, stylized scarabs, and tiered pyramid shapes into skyscrapers and cinemas.
Fashion designers adopted Egyptian silhouettes and colors. The discovery proved that the aesthetic power of this ancient civilization was still incredibly potent 3,000 years later.
It is wild to think about a teenager who died millennia ago, heavily influencing the flapper dresses and the architecture of the Roaring '20s.
It really is.
But as mind-blowing as the artifacts in that tomb are, they still leave a massive blind spot in our understanding, don't they?
They do, because a tomb is inherently a space designed for eternity.
It's static.
Exactly. It tells us how the ancient Egyptians conceptualized death, the afterlife, and the absolute peak of elite luxury. But you cannot fully understand a society solely by examining its cemeteries.
Right. If a future archaeologist only dug up modern graveyards, they would think we all just lay around in velvet-lined boxes wearing our best suits.
They would have absolutely no idea about traffic jams or grocery stores or factories.
If you want to know how the Egyptians generated the immense wealth required to furnish a tomb like Tutankhamun's, you have to look at their living infrastructure.
You need a living, breathing industrial hub.
But finding one is incredibly difficult, isn't it?
Which is why the discovery announced in 2020 is considered one of the most important archaeological events since Tutankhamun.
Let's get into this. Archaeologists uncovered a massive, remarkably preserved urban center known as the Lost Golden City of Aten.
Founded by Amenhotep III, who, interestingly enough, was Tutankhamun's grandfather.
Our sources emphasize that this wasn't just a few scattered foundations in the sand. This was a vast, sprawling metropolis.
A true city.
But before we get into what they actually found there, let's explain why finding a city is so rare.
That's an important distinction to make.
We have hundreds of stone temples and pyramids. Why did it take until 2020 to find a major preserved city?
The mechanism of preservation is entirely different based on the materials they used. The Egyptians understood permanence very well.
So they built the houses of eternity, temples for the gods, tombs for the dead out of durable limestone and granite.
And they built them out in the dry, arid desert where they wouldn't be disturbed by water. Those materials survive.
But the cities for the living.
They were built on the fertile floodplains of the Nile, where the agriculture actually was. And they built their homes, palaces, and factories out of sun-baked mud brick.
Because it's cheap, it's insulating, and the raw material is literally the mud from the riverbank right next to them.
Exactly. But mud brick is highly susceptible to moisture. Over thousands of years, as the Nile flooded annually, and as successive generations continuously tore down old mud brick houses to build new ones on top of the exact same spot.
The cities just kind of melted.
They did. Those ancient cities essentially melted back into the earth. The archaeological record of daily urban life was continually erased by the elements and by human habitation.
So how did the city of Aten survive that cycle?
Aten survived because of a unique historical anomaly tied directly back to that religious revolution we discussed earlier.
Oh, Akhenaten again.
Yep. When Amenhotep III's son, Akhenaten, took power, he abandoned the area entirely to build his new heretical capital out in the desert.
So the bustling industrial city of Aten was rapidly depopulated.
It was left empty. It wasn't built over by later generations. Instead, the desert sands quickly blew over the abandoned mud brick walls, sealing the city in a dry, protective layer before it could melt away in the floods.
It was just frozen in time.
Exactly.
And when archaeologists finally brushed away that sand in 2020, they found the 9-to-5 reality of an ancient superpower. The details in the source material here are just phenomenal.
They really are. They didn't just find a jumble of houses. They found highly specific zoned districts.
Like modern urban planning.
Yes. They mapped out distinct residential neighborhoods with these unique, zigzagging mud brick walls, and architectural design aimed at security and controlling traffic flow through the streets.
The urban planning is incredibly sophisticated, but the true value of Ayrton lies in the industrial zones, right? This wasn't just a bedroom community, it was an economic engine.
It was a massive production center.
The archaeologists uncovered a massive bakery district, complete with ovens and storage pottery, capable of industrial-scale food production just to feed the huge workforce.
But they also found the high-end manufacturing zones. They discovered workshops filled with the specific tools, molds, and raw slag used for making glass and faience jewelry.
They found the actual kilns.
They found the kilns, they found the casting molds, they found the administrative centers where bureaucrats were managing the supply chains.
By analyzing a site like Aten, we can really reconstruct the macroeconomy of the empire.
You can trace the entire life cycle of a luxury good. You can see exactly where the raw materials were imported, how they were processed in these specific workshops by the skilled artisans.
The same class of people who lived at Deir el-Medina.
Exactly. And you can see how the finished products were cataloged by administrators before being sent off. We're looking at the functioning supply chain that generated the wealth we eventually see buried in the royal tombs.
It perfectly grounds the civilization. When you look at a beautiful golden necklace in a museum, it's so easy to just think, oh, ancient magic, a god made this.
But it wasn't magic. It was labor.
Right. When you look at the scorched kilns and the broken casting molds in the city of Aten, you realize a guy named Tammuz woke up on a Tuesday, walked through the zigzag streets, grabbed a loaf of bread from the industrial bakery, and spent 10 hours sweating over a hot furnace to make that necklace.
It demystifies the grandeur and highlights the incredible human logistics required to sustain an empire of that size.
It really does. But realizing the sheer scale of their domestic production forces us to ask an even larger question.
Which is?
All this wealth, all this manufacturing, all this glass and gold, where was it going, and who are they trading with?
Yes. This is a vital pivot for understanding their place in the world.
Because the popular myth often portrays ancient Egypt as the solitary, untouchable jewel of the ancient world. Just an isolated kingdom surrounded by empty desert doing its own thing.
But you don't build massive industrial hubs just to hoard everything internally.
No. The evidence proves they were deeply, aggressively connected to the rest of the world. And the absolute best proof of that isn't a factory, it's a filing cabinet.
You're referring to the Amarna Letters, discovered in 1887.
I am.
This is undoubtedly one of the most consequential finds for understanding ancient geopolitics.
Let's set the scene for this discovery. The Amarna Letters were found at the site of Akhenaten's short-lived desert capital.
Right, the one he built during his religious revolution.
Local villagers were digging in the ruins and stumbled upon a massive cache of clay tablets, over 300 of them. And once scholars translated them, they realized they were looking at the official diplomatic archives of the Egyptian Foreign Office.
It was essentially the server room of the Bronze Age United Nations.
I love that analogy. These tablets contain the direct, unvarnished correspondence between the Egyptian royal court and the rulers of other massive contemporary global powers.
We're talking about the empires of Babylon, Assyria, the Mitanni, and the Hittites.
And the most stunning detail about these tablets, the thing that completely shatters the idea of an isolated Egypt, is the language they are written in. These are letters sent to and from the Egyptian pharaoh, found in an Egyptian archive, but they are not written in Egyptian hieroglyphics.
They were written in Akkadian cuneiform.
Why on earth is the Egyptian pharaoh conducting official state business in a foreign language?
Because Akkadian, which was the script of Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, had become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East.
The universal language of trade.
Exactly. The Mesopotamian empires had established the dominant trade networks centuries earlier, and their language became the absolute standard for international communication.
So if you wanted to do business, you had to speak Akkadian.
Right. The fact that the Egyptian Foreign Office employed highly trained scribes who could read and write in complex Akkadian cuneiform proves that Egypt was actively participating in a shared international diplomatic system.
It's the ancient equivalent of globalization.
It really is.
To use a modern analogy, it is exactly like how English acts as the standard language for international aviation today. You can have a Japanese pilot flying a French airplane into an airport in Brazil, and everyone is communicating with air traffic control in English.
Because it's a shared operating system that prevents planes from crashing.
Exactly. Akkadian cuneiform was the operating system that kept these Bronze Age empires from constantly destroying each other.
That is a perfect parallel. They weren't living in an insular bubble at all. They were a central, vital node in a vast, highly volatile international network.
And the contents of the letters themselves are just fascinating to me because they reveal the deeply human, almost petty reality of international relations.
They aren't writing profound poetry to each other, that's for sure.
No. I was reading through some of the translations provided in our sources, and it is basically high-stakes diplomatic whining. They are writing incredibly stressed-out emails.
Exactly. The letters are filled with intense negotiations over trade tariffs, border disputes, and the exchange of luxury goods.
Give us an example.
Well, you have the king of Babylon writing to the pharaoh, complaining bitterly that the gold statues Egypt sent him were actually just wood plated with gold, and he is deeply offended by it.
Literally saying, I tested the gold, it's fake, send better gold.
Precisely. Don't cheap out on me, I know what real gold looks like.
That's amazing.
Or you have lesser kings in the Levant, modern-day Syria and Lebanon, sending desperate, panic-stricken letters to the pharaoh, begging for military archers, because a rival faction is actively burning down their cities.
And you have endless negotiations regarding diplomatic marriages, haggling over the bride price like they're at a flea market.
It proves they were constantly managing complex alliances, dealing with supply chain shortages, and trying to appease highly volatile foreign leaders.
The Amarna Letters just take the pharaoh completely off his divine pedestal and drop him right into the middle of a messy, complicated geopolitical chessboard.
It is the ultimate humanization of the empire. But, we have to remember that this archaeological detective work, this constant unearthing of new evidence that refines our understanding, is not just a historical phenomenon from the 1800s or the 1920s.
Right. The discipline is highly active right now.
This story isn't over.
We are still actively pulling back the curtain, which brings us to the very end of the Egyptian historical arc and the ongoing excavations happening today. We are talking about the era of Cleopatra.
Cleopatra VII was the last active ruler of the Ptolemaic Kingdom of Egypt. Her death essentially marks the final absorption of Egypt into the Roman Empire.
And for centuries, her actual physical footprint has been incredibly elusive, largely because the ancient royal quarter of her capital, Alexandria, collapsed into the Mediterranean Sea due to earthquakes and tsunamis.
It's literally underwater.
But our sources highlight a massive ongoing excavation at a site called Taposiris Magna, located just west of Alexandria. Archaeologists are out there right now, actively digging, searching for evidence of her reign and potentially her lost tomb.
Now, the source acknowledges the reality here. The grand prize, the intact tomb of Cleopatra, remains undiscovered. We've not had a King Tut moment for her yet.
But that is exactly why this site is so important to discuss, because the popular media always focuses on the gold mask, the hidden tomb, the monumental Hollywood discovery.
Right, the shiny things.
But you don't need to find a golden sarcophagus to rewrite history. The things they are finding at Taposiris Magna right now are providing massive amounts of hard data.
Absolutely. The real history is found in the accumulation of mundane data. The teams at Taposiris Magna have utilized advanced underwater mapping technology to locate a massive, submerged port complex off the coast.
Which is incredible on its own.
They have uncovered intricate temple foundations, and crucially, they have found thousands of coins minted during her reign.
Let's talk about the coins, because I think that is where the real intelligence is. A coin isn't just money, it's a piece of state propaganda and economic data.
Exactly.
When archaeologists find thousands of coins bearing Cleopatra's actual face, what does that tell us that a Roman history book doesn't?
It tells us how she presented herself to her own people. And that contrasts sharply with the smear campaigns written by her Roman enemies, who portrayed her merely as a seductive, manipulative, foreign temptress.
The coins show a ruler emphasizing her political legitimacy and divine right to rule.
Yes. Furthermore, analyzing the metallic composition of those coins, the specific ratio of silver to bronze, allows economists to track inflation, trade disruptions, and the actual financial health of the state during her conflicts with Rome.
It's ancient forensic accounting. Finding a submerged port and thousands of coins tells us about the naval logistics, the trade routes, and the daily transactions of her citizens.
It's the exact same principle as the city of Aten or the Amarna Letters. The truth is in the infrastructure.
And the thrill of the chase is still so alive. Thousands of years later, entire submerged ports are just waiting under the waves.
It reinforces the core philosophy of archaeology. The picture is never complete. There is no final chapter.
There's always more dirt to move.
Every new excavation, whether it yields a royal monument or just a collection of everyday broken pottery, provides a new data point. It forces us to continually question our assumptions, update our models, and let the hard evidence guide our understanding.
This has been an incredibly expansive journey for us today. Just to synthesize the massive paradigm shift we have covered for you, we started by looking at a civilization that was completely mute, wrapped in myths of magic and slavery.
But by simply allowing the evidence to speak, We cracked the code of their language, turning mystical runes into phonetic sounds that let us read their medical records and their petty neighborly disputes.
We examine the physical infrastructure of the workers, dismantling the myth of the brutalized slave, and revealing a complex, organized society of compensated artisans who possessed the social leverage to execute the first labor strikes in history.
We looked at the irony of political erasure, discovering how a state-sponsored attempt to cancel King Tutankhamun accidentally preserved the greatest time capsule of royal wealth and theology the world has ever seen.
We brushed the sand off the lost city of Aten, mapping the industrial supply chains and the 9-to-5 reality of an ancient superpower.
And we read their diplomatic mail, proving that they were not an isolated kingdom in the desert, but a deeply connected, highly sophisticated node in a globalized Bronze Age network, negotiating in a shared foreign language.
Ancient Egypt is not a static museum exhibit. It was a deeply human, incredibly messy, brilliant, and complex civilization.
And we only know that because generation after generation of scholars refused to accept the myth and went looking for the dirt under the fingernails truth.
I want to leave you with one final thought to mull over. We have spent this entire deep dive dismantling the completely wrong, romanticized assumptions that we held about ancient Egypt for centuries.
Although many assumptions.
Imagine a future civilization 3,000 years from now. They're digging through the ruins of our cities long after our digital records have decayed and our servers have melted.
That's a haunting thought.
What completely wrong, romanticized myth might they believe about us? When they look at the massive concrete shells of our football stadiums or our bank vaults, what Hollywood-style assumptions will they make about our gods and our magic?
Oh, they'll definitely think the stadiums are temples.
Without a doubt. And more importantly, what single mundane thing, what future Rosetta Stone or Amarna letter or simple preserved receipt from a local grocery store would they have to dig out of the dirt to finally realize the complex, stressful, and deeply human truth of who we really were?
That is a fantastic question to leave on.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the myths around you, keep looking for the evidence, and we will see you next time.
This is The Brief on Ancient Egyptian Discoveries. For centuries, ancient Egypt was treated like a mystical legend, but groundbreaking archaeological discoveries have replaced romanticized myths with hard evidence, revealing a complex, deeply human civilization. First, the Rosetta Stone unlocked an entire civilization. Discovered in 1799, it featured the same decree in Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs. By the 1820s, scholar Jean-François Champollion cracked the code, proving hieroglyphs were a complex mix of phonetic and symbolic elements. It's kind of like finding the ultimate translation app for 3,000 years of history. Mystical symbols suddenly became readable royal records, personal letters, and medical texts. Once we could read their everyday records, we realized we had completely misunderstood the people doing the heavy lifting for the empire. Second, the pyramid builders were respected laborers, not enslaved people. Excavations at worker villages like Deir el-Medina dismantled the myth started by the historian Herodotus. Archaeologists found organized housing, state-provided food, wages, and skilled artisans who could read and write. Seriously, can you imagine an ancient labor union organizing a strike over unpaid wages? These workers were well-fed and absolutely vital to national stability. This high level of organization wasn't just domestic. Uncovering their diplomatic mail proved they were just as organized on the global stage. Finally, Egypt was a globally connected powerhouse, not an isolated desert empire. The 1887 discovery of the Amarna Letters, clay tablets written in Akkadian cuneiform, revealed rich diplomatic correspondence with major powers like Babylon and Assyria. It's like uncovering an ancient equivalent of a UN email server, proving they were central players in an international political network. Step by step, archaeology has chipped away at the myths, showing us that ancient Egypt wasn't just a land of mystical tombs, but a richly documented, working, and connected society.
Welcome to the debate. When a historian tries to reconstruct the ancient past, they are immediately confronted with, well, a pretty massive inherent tension in the surviving evidence.
Right. A tension between what people say happened and what actually happened.
Exactly. Imagine, if you will, that you are exploring this abandoned ancestral estate. You walk into the parlor, and resting on a polished table, you find a beautifully curated photo album. I mean, everyone in it is smiling, perfectly posed.
Wearing their absolute Sunday best.
Right. And that album tells you exactly how that family wanted to be seen. It gives you their names, their formal relationships, their official narrative, basically.
Yeah, but it is a highly controlled presentation. I mean, it's a performance. You take that same house, right? And then you walk into the kitchen. You look down and you see the deep, worn scuff marks on the floorboards. You find burnt, dented pots, maybe some hastily repaired tools just shoved into a corner.
The stuff they actually used.
Exactly. That kitchen doesn't lie. It has no PR department. It shows you the unvarnished reality of how they actually lived, what they ate, and, just how hard they worked to survive.
And that profound tension between the stories we tell about ourselves and the physical reality of how we actually live, that is at the very heart of how we understand antiquity. I mean, for centuries, ancient Egypt was viewed through this lens of romanticized mystery.
Oh, totally. A land of curses, silent monoliths, inscrutable magic.
Well, today it stands as a deeply documented, phenomenally complex civilization. And we achieve this transformation by chipping away at those myths, replacing wild speculation with concrete evidence.
Which brings us to the core intellectual tension we're exploring today. What type of evidence fundamentally drives our true understanding of this ancient past? I mean, do we rely on the recovery of a civilization's written voice and its official diplomacy? Or is the profound truth only found in the dirt, the physical unearthing of their lived material reality?
Well, I argue that textual and linguistic breakthroughs are the definitive catalyst for understanding any ancient society. Because, look, until we can read a civilization's words, they remain a silent legend.
And I argue that written text is inherently biased elite propaganda. True historical reality is only found in the dirt, through the unearthing of material artifacts and living spaces.
Okay, let me lay out why the written word is the ultimate key here. Before the discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, European scholars looked at the walls of Egyptian temples and essentially saw magic.
Right. They thought it was all mystical symbols.
Exactly. They believed hieroglyphs were pure ideograms, like that a carving of a bird didn't represent a sound, but this abstract, esoteric concept of the soul or flight. Because they couldn't read the text, Egypt was a mute monolith.
But the Rosetta Stone changed everything.
Because it had the Greek translation. Right, it featured the exact same decree written in 3 scripts: formal hieroglyphs, everyday demotic, and ancient Greek. Since we could read Greek, we finally had a linguistic key. So in the 1820s, a scholar named Jean-François Champollion does something brilliant. He doesn't just stare at the symbols, he looks at the Greek text for royal names, specifically Ptolemy.
And he matched them up with the cartouches.
Yes! He found the corresponding oval rings in the hieroglyphic text and deduced that the symbols inside weren't abstract concepts, but phonetic sounds. A square represented a P. A half circle was a T, a lion an L. He proved that hieroglyphs were a highly sophisticated writing system that mixed phonetic and symbolic elements.
I mean, it was a massive breakthrough. I won't deny that.
It gave them an alphabet, a grammar, a syntax. In a matter of years, 3 millennia of history became readable. We gained unprecedented access to the mind of the society. We could suddenly read their incredibly complex religious doctrines like the Book of the Dead.
But
We could read early medical practices, legal codes, personal poetry. Without the text, we are merely guessing at the meaning behind the stones. The text is the engine that shifted Egypt from a myth to a documented civilization.
look, I come at it from a totally different way. While reading their words is undeniably fascinating, relying on text is incredibly dangerous if your goal is actual historical truth.
Dangerous? That's a strong word.
It is, but it's true. Text is written by the victors, the elites, the state apparatus. It is by its very nature biased and curated. If we truly want to understand how a civilization functioned, we have to look at the physical reality. Let's look at the most persistent myth in all of Egyptology, the idea that the Great Pyramids were built by legions of slaves.
Ah, yes, the Hollywood version of history.
Exactly. And where did that come from? For over 2,000 years, historians blindly relied on the texts of later Greek writers, primarily Herodotus. He claimed that 100,000 slaves were whipped into dragging multi-ton blocks across the desert.
Which we now know is entirely false.
Right. That written record painted a picture of a brutal, tyrannical society. So how was that myth dismantled? It wasn't by finding a new scroll. It was through physical, material excavations at places like Deir el-Medina and the Worker Plateau at Giza. Archaeologists uncovered the actual worker villages.
They found the barracks.
Highly organized barracks and family housing. We found massive industrial bakeries with intricate bread molds, huge vats for brewing high-calorie beer. I mean, slaves are not paid in premium high-calorie meat, bread, and beer rations.
Fair point.
Furthermore, archaeologists found beautifully constructed tombs for these workers, built right next to the pyramids. You do not let a slave build a tomb in the shadow of a living god. The material evidence proved the mechanism of their labor. This was a corvée system.
A form of national taxation, essentially.
Paid and labored during the inundation season, when the Nile flooded and farming was impossible. These were respected, highly organized citizens fulfilling a civic duty. Action and material reality, unearthing the actual kitchens and living quarters of these workers, proved their true status. The text lied. The dirt told the truth.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. To truly understand a civilization, you cannot just look at the bricks they laid or the bread molds they left behind. Let me use an analogy here.
Okay, let's hear it.
The material artifacts, the worker villages, the tools, the housing, they are merely the hardware of a civilization. You can look at a computer's motherboard, admire the intricate circuitry, and know that it does something incredibly complex. But text is the operating system. You absolutely cannot understand how the society truly functions, its diplomatic protocols, its economic treaties, its geopolitical fears, without reading the code.
I disagree. The hardware dictates what is actually possible. The operating system just tells you what the programmer wanted it to do.
But the operating system reveals their network. Consider the Amarna Letters, discovered in 1887. This was a cache of clay tablets found in Upper Egypt. But here is the fascinating part. They weren't written in Egyptian hieroglyphs.
They were in Akkadian cuneiform.
Exactly. Why? Because Akkadian was the English of the late Bronze Age. It was the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient Near East. Because we could read this operating system, we learned something that no amount of scattered pottery or foundational bricks could ever definitively tell us. Egypt was not an isolated, insular empire sitting alone in the desert.
It showed they were connected.
Deeply connected. It was a central player in an international political network. These tablets contain letters between the Egyptian pharaoh and the kings of Babylon, Assyria, the Hittites, and they aren't just formal decrees, they are full of petty, deeply human diplomacy.
Kings haggling over gifts, right?
Yes. We read kings complaining, like, "Why did you send me less gold than your father did?" Or negotiating royal marriages to secure military alliances. That single textual discovery completely reshaped our perception of Egypt's global influence. The text gives us the mechanics of their geopolitical reality.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why your operating system analogy actually proves my point entirely. Software can be rewritten, it can be hacked, it can be maliciously deleted.
Well, sure, propaganda existed.
Textual records in antiquity were routinely manipulated by scribes to hide the truth or rewrite history to favor the current regime. If we rely on your operating system, we are entirely at the mercy of the ancient state's censorship. Let's look at the history of Tutankhamun.
Ah, yes. A pharaoh who is world famous today.
Famous today, yes, but deliberately and systematically erased by his own people. We have to look at the mechanics of why. Tutankhamun's father, Akhenaten, instituted massive, highly controversial religious reforms.
The Amarna period.
Right. He essentially upended 1,000 years of polytheistic tradition, shutting down the temples of Amun to force a shift toward a form of monotheism worshiping the sun disk, the Aten. It was a massive disruption to the economy and the priesthood. When that regime eventually fell, the subsequent rulers instituted a damnatio memoria.
A literal condemnation of memory.
They took chisels and hacked Tutankhamun's name off monuments. They omitted him entirely from the official written king lists. The textual record, the very operating system you prize, deliberately erased him. If we relied only on text, Tutankhamun simply wouldn't exist in our historical memory. It was only because his physical, material tomb survived the ancient censors that we even know he lived.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Yes, the state apparatus attempted to erase him from the monumental texts. But let's look at what actually happened when Howard Carter discovered Tutankhamun's nearly intact tomb in 1922.
The greatest archaeological find of the century.
Exactly. What do we find? Over 5,000 artifacts. We found the famous golden death mask, the disassembled chariots, the ritual couches carved like lions. It was an unprecedented snapshot of royal burial customs, mostly because it hadn't been heavily looted. But here's my pushback. Those 5,000 artifacts would be entirely incomprehensible without the vast corpus of Egyptian text we had already deciphered.
Come on, we can understand the spectacular craftsmanship of a solid gold mask without reading a single word.
We can appreciate its aesthetic beauty, sure. We can measure the purity of the gold and observe the artisanship. But we only understand its purpose because we can read the Book of the Dead. We know exactly why a carved heart scrab is placed over the mummy's chest.
To stop the heart from speaking out.
Right, the text tells us the mechanics of their theology. The scarab is inscribed with a spell to prevent the deceased's own heart from testifying against them when it is weighed on the scales of truth in the underworld. We know the exact perilous theological journey the pharaoh is supposed to take. Without the textual context, the afterlife beliefs, the specific religious doctrines, Carter's discovery is just a pile of incredibly expensive gold.
Okay.
But the text is what elevates the artifacts from mere treasure hunting to profound historical anthropology.
That is a compelling argument regarding the theology. I'll give you that. But have you considered the fundamental nature of a tomb itself? A tomb, even a perfectly preserved, text-heavy one like Tutankhamun's, is still a highly curated, performative space.
It's the photo album again.
It is the absolute pinnacle of that posed photograph album we discussed earlier. It represents an idealized, mythologized version of death and the afterlife. It is designed by elites for an elite. It does not tell us how Egypt functioned on a Tuesday. The ultimate paradigm shift in understanding a civilization comes not from unearthing the curated dead, but from unearthing the living spaces.
You're referring to the recent urban discoveries, which, I admit, have been remarkable.
Exactly. Take the 2020 discovery of the vast city of Aten, often called the Lost Golden City, founded by Amenhotep III. This is a profound counterbalance to the opulent tombs in the Valley of the Kings. Aten was a living, breathing, working metropolis.
What did they find there that changes the narrative?
When archaeologists excavated it, they didn't find highly idealized rituals. They found real residential districts. They found distinct neighborhoods separated by unique zigzagging brick walls, designed both for security and to deflect the harsh desert winds. They found industrial workshops.
Right, the glass-making centers.
They uncovered jewelry-making centers, kilns for firing glass and faience, ovens, administrative buildings, and the preservation of this city offers us a rare, unedited look at everyday urban life at the absolute height of Egyptian power. This is the kitchen with the scuffed floorboards.
It's a spectacular window into their daily infrastructure, yes.
No one curates an industrial glass-making workshop for posterity. It is an authentic snapshot of lived reality, far removed from the idealized decrees carved into temple walls. We found the tools they dropped, the hearths where they cooked. It bypasses the elite narrative completely.
Well, I'm not entirely convinced by that line of reasoning because you are implying that text only represents the elite, the curated, and the dead. But the deciphered texts we have recovered go far beyond royal decrees. They include massive archives of personal letters and daily administrative notes. I would argue the text actually democratizes our understanding of the civilization.
Democratizes? How does an elite scribal practice democratize our understanding?
Because of what they wrote about. Let me give you an example from the very material you are championing. In that incredible city of Aten, archaeologists found a specific vessel containing 2 gallons of boiled meat that was prepared for a festival.
I remember that, yeah.
But what makes that discovery truly spectacular is that the vessel had a textural inscription on it. It named the butcher who prepared the meat, a man named Iwi, and it named the specific farm the meat came from. When we read a label identifying a working-class butcher, or say a medical papyrus detailing exactly how a physician should treat a fractured skull or a crocodile bite, We are seeing the daily intellectual life of the people.
That's a great detail, but
Text isn't just for kings boasting on monuments. It is the very fabric of human communication. It brings the living, breathing individuals like Iwi the butcher out of the shadow of those massive industrial workshops you mentioned.
that is a beautiful detail. But we have to be brutally honest about the mechanics of who was actually doing the writing in this society. Literacy in ancient Egypt was incredibly limited. Scholars estimate it was somewhere around 1 to 5%.
It was a specialized skill, yes.
A highly exclusive one. The vast, overwhelming majority of the population, the farmers working the Nile inundation, the soldiers, the glassmakers in the city of Aten, the builders at Deir el-Medina, they could not read or write. If you rely on text to democratize history, you are inherently only hearing the voices of the top 5% of the society, the scribal class and the elites. Material evidence, on the other hand, truly democratizes our understanding because everyone leaves a physical footprint.
But surely those physical footprints require interpretation, which text provides.
They require excavation, but the actions speak louder than the missing text. Let's go back to Deir el-Medina, the worker village. The official texts might gloss over internal strife to present an image of perfect societal harmony, known as ma'at. But the material and contextual record shows us something entirely different. It reveals the first recorded labor strike in human history.
Under Ramses III.
Exactly. The workers' monthly grain rations were 18 days late. And what did these builders do? The physical record shows they literally dropped their copper chisels, walked off the job site, and staged to sit in at the local mortuary temple. They bypassed the local magistrates and demanded their pay.
That is a staggering historical reality. I agree.
You do not strike if you are a subjugated slave. You strike if you are an empowered, valued artisan who possesses the economic leverage to literally shut down the pharaoh's afterlife preparations. That event gives us a concrete understanding of the working class's social organization and power dynamics. That footprint, that action, is far more representative of the Egyptian populace than any surviving personal letter from a literate scribe complaining about his neighbor.
Okay, I see the immense value in that physical footprint. A sit-in the late Bronze Age is, well, it's incredible. But as we draw our discussion toward a close, I maintain my core position. Deciphering scripts like Greek, Demotic, and hieroglyphs on the Rosetta Stone was the monumental key.
It opened a lot of doors, certainly.
It allowed Egypt to shift from a romanticized mystery, a land of mute towering monuments, into a richly documented civilization. By reading their words, whether it's in the Amarna Letters detailing the complex chess game of international diplomacy, or the intricate religious texts guiding their souls through the underworld, we gave voice to a deeply human, conceptually sophisticated society. The material hardware tells you that a civilization existed. The operating system of text tells you exactly how they thought, feared, and who they actually were.
And I maintain that relying entirely on the written word is an open invitation to be deceived by ancient propaganda. Material discoveries serve as the ultimate historical reality check. I mean, from the massive breweries at the worker villages that logically dismantled the centuries-old slave myth, to the vast, unedited industrial sprawl of the lost city of Aten, physical evidence bypasses the erasures and the curated lies of the state. It grounds a romanticized mystery, not in idealized magic, but in dirt, sweat, and undeniable lived reality.
Yet, we must acknowledge that these two streams of evidence do not exist in a vacuum, right? They continuously interact and challenge one another to replace speculation with fact. And we are seeing this very dynamic play out right now with the ongoing excavations at Teposiris Magna, an active site intricately linked to Cleopatra's era.
Yes, that is a perfect modern example of this intersection. At Teposiris Magna, archaeologists have uncovered thousands of material artifacts. They found caches of coins, statues, even the infrastructure of a massive submerged port out in the Mediterranean.
But not the queen herself.
No, Cleopatra's actual tomb and presumably the rich textual records and libraries that would accompany a Ptolemaic queen of her stature remain completely undiscovered.
But here is the fascinating part. Even without her personal texts, the recovery of those material artifacts is pushing history forward. The sheer volume of coins bearing her image and the staggering logistical scale of that submerged port are actively rewriting the regional and economic history of her reign as we speak. It proves that the physical artifacts can bridge the gap and reveal her immense power while we continue to search for the written word.
Or perhaps it proves that we don't necessarily need the written word to understand the immense economic leverage she wielded. I mean, the physical reality of the port itself, the stone, the sheer tonnage of ships it could handle, that speaks volumes about her trade networks and naval capabilities. The material dictates the geopolitical reality.
It is a dynamic, thrilling tension that will likely never be fully resolved. So we leave it to you, our listener, to evaluate the evidence. When you look back at the grand scope of human history, which carries more weight in capturing the absolute truth of a complex, deeply human civilization? Is it the curated photograph album, complete with names, deciphered letters, and official stories? Or is it the scuffed floorboards of the kitchen, revealing the unvarnished reality of how they labored, built, and lived? The answer shapes not just how we view antiquity, but how we understand our own legacy today.
Until next time, keep questioning the narrative.